We pick up here with 11.1, Section 1, Part 2, covering the end of the section. So here in the book, they talk about Jackson being elected as president in 1828, and there are so many people that are happy with Jackson's election because basically he is the first quote-unquote common man candidate. The idea that he is a war hero, he is a person that comes from a very hard background. He was born in a log cabin that has dirt floors. He's an orphan. He loses his brother. He loses his mother. He basically has a very hard life growing up, but he basically trains and educates himself. And so many commoners, the average people, look up to him because even though by his election he's not common anymore, he does identify with the quote-unquote average man, and people think he is like them. And so that's why so many people were happy. The reason why he's known as Old Hickory is his military background, his toughness. If you know anything about hickory, hickory is a really tough wood. And so back then and today sometimes they like to refer to military leaders with the word old or ol, O-L. So he's Old Hickory, dealing with his toughness as a man, as a military leader. The last one on this page is asking you, how does suffrage, which is the right to vote, how does it expand over this time? Well, remember, the four qualifications for voting back then were obviously white, male, 21 years of age, and a landowner. Okay? So what the answer is, more men got the right to vote. So what changes in those four is the idea of the land ownership. Voting qualifications and land requirements are reduced during this time period. And when they reduce, they allow for more people to be eligible to vote. And so the percentages jump dramatically, almost up near 60% of the people who were meeting all the other requirements began to meet the requirements for land ownership. So that's why Jacksonian democracy is really an expansion of democracy across the country. Now in this picture and this slide here, you see Jackson over here, and it looks like, and it is true, he is riding a pig, and it says, to the victor goes the spoils, belongs the spoils. So spoils have always been the rewards of winning. And so when we talk about Jackson as president, in the spoils system they introduce you to is the idea where the winning candidate gets to reward his supporters with jobs. And so asking the question, in the spoils system, what were the spoils? They are government jobs. The problem of doing that is that you sometimes would have people in jobs that are not really well qualified for that. And so he doesn't start the spoils system, but he really allows it to flourish during his 2 terms. Some on his own watch, and then some where he basically allowed others to hire people who maybe were not the best or most qualified individuals. The tariff debate comes up again. Remember, the tariff is a tax on imported goods. Why do people from different parts of the country feel different ways? Well, as we discussed before, Northerners like and support and want a tariff, because what it does is it helps their industries. Remember that New England and the Northeast is a place of growing business and manufacturing, and so they can't really easily compete with their European counterparts because they're just better at it. And so a way to make it easier is to make foreign goods more expensive. And the way that you would do that is to add a tax, and that tax is just simply known as a tariff. Now, Southerners, on the other hand, they hated it. They hated the tariff because basically what happened was it made their lives and their goods more expensive. So they're buying the same products, but it's costing them more. And so they disagree with the very idea of a tariff on foreign imported goods. So in the tariff debate, they need a leader, and that leader is John C. Calhoun. John C. Calhoun was a former war hawk. He is a former senator from South Carolina, and he is definitely supporting the South in their opposition. And so they believe, this new group of leaders believe, that they have the right of something called nullification, or to nullify a federal law that they felt was unfair. So why do you think they called it? Well, they called it the Tariff of Abominations because they hated it so much, that it was something that it was a disgust and hatred. And so that's why they called it such. So South Carolina is going to be a leader in the fight against the tariff at the time period. So as we get into this, we have to understand where those ideas come from. Where did they believe that they had the right to nullify a federal law? The answer to that question goes back to the start of our country. And it goes back to the idea of the two parties that form and the two different opinions on how government should work. So if we remember Madison and Jefferson, James Madison and Thomas Jefferson wrote these documents known as the Kentucky and Virginia Resolutions. And in that, they made a case that the laws that were around at the time that they so were against were the Alien and Sedition Acts. Remember those? Because they felt that those things were unconstitutional, that they were the president and Congress overstepping their bounds and limiting the rights of Americans. And so what they had at the time, these Southern leaders with nullification, is basically the next step. So instead of declaring the law unconstitutional, that's not really what they're discussing anymore. Now they just want to move forward with canceling it, rejecting it, allowing a state to basically ignore a federal law. And so that's what Robert Hayne down here and Daniel Webster are really engaged in this famous debate that occurs in the United States Senate. Hayne is for the South and for the theory of nullification, and Daniel Webster is for the North and a unionist. And pretty much they're arguing over this idea: could states nullify or cancel a law? And basically, Daniel Webster says, if this starts, then that's it. There is no such thing as the United States of America. States can't be willy-nilly and decide, I like this law and follow it, and that one I don't, so I'm going to nullify it. The idea is that this was where Daniel Webster's famous quote, "Liberty and union, now and forever, one and inseparable," originates. Once he says, once we go down this path, then that is the dissolution of the Union, because you cannot have a country in that kind of form. So we come to the end here, and we're going to talk about how this issue is obviously going to be resolved. So you have South Carolina and Southerners threatening to not follow the law, to reject it. So that law that was passed in 1828, that they, of course, so much protest and hate and nullify and threaten to reject it, that they call the Tariff of Abominations, there's got to be some kind of way out of this, that both sides can get something and not tear the country apart. And so what happens here is that you have this policy moving forward that some states are even getting so crazy to the point where they're threatening to break away or to secede from the country. And so what makes it even worse is that President Jackson, his main opposition comes from none other than his vice president, John C. Calhoun, who is speaking on behalf of Southerners, feeling that this is a states' rights issue, that this is an issue that he has to defend, being a loyal, Southerner. And so what happens is that you have to figure out, how is this going to all work itself out? So what happens is Jackson says, listen, I am going to enforce this tariff. And once we get to Henry Clay, we'll come back to him in a second. And that is, Jackson's at a dinner where they are discussing, obviously, this crisis and this idea of union and nullifying and secession. And Jackson is asked to basically say a toast, and he stands up and says, the Union, it must be preserved. And everyone sort of agrees, yes, 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 the Union must be preserved. And then they turn to his vice president, and John C. Calhoun stands up and holds up a glass and says, the Union, next to our liberty, most dear. And so what that phrase is that basically he's saying, yes, the country is important, but my freedom is just as or more important than the country. So the idea that you can't have a country that is limiting your freedom. And so what has to happen is we have good old Henry Clay in here, and he's going to basically get a compromise going. He's going to work both sides, and he's going to try and figure this out. So how do you make the South and North happy about the tariff? Well, the South doesn't want it, the North wants it. He comes up with the idea, let's have it for now, and let's reduce it over time. That makes them happy. And then Jackson, he wants to have the ability to take the military, and if need be, use it to enforce federal law, just like President Washington did during the Whiskey Rebellion, where he basically rode out into Western PA to enforce the whiskey tax. So that's what Jackson is thinking too. Jackson got so far that he actually said that these men were committing treason, and that if John C. Calhoun continues, that as he marches in and finds John C. Calhoun, he will execute him and hang him from the first tree he finds suitable. So John C. Calhoun is afraid for his life. So he's basically gonna bow out of the vice presidency, and Jackson's gonna pick a new VP. But finally, Jackson gets this force bill that allows him to use the military if need be. And so that's how the tariff debate and nullification crisis comes to a resolution. Okay. The last things I just want to talk about here, as I did in class, is that when we think of the Democrats, we think of the donkey. And, oops, I'm sorry. I'm going to stop it here and come back to you guys in a second. So hopefully this is a little bit better for you, that you can sort of see it. I know you can see most of it. But the idea is, this came from a cartoon at the time when Jackson was president. And yeah, that's Jackson in the middle. I know he looks really scary, but they kind of played on the whole idea of the age of Jackson. They sort of exaggerate and make him look very old. But basically, some of the papers referred to him as President Andrew Jackass, meaning he was being stubborn and being difficult and just being a pain. And so there was a person who was a cartoonist, and they just said, I'm going to just draw him for the person that we think he is, which is a donkey, a jackass, really stubborn, which is a trait sometimes attributed to donkeys. Well, Jackson, being the swift guy that he was, he actually took this and then turned it into a compliment. He thought, yeah, I'm stubborn. And so people began to use the image of the donkey in association with Jackson and the Democrats. And so kind of the image stuck, as we say. So it actually originates from a political cartoon of the time. And then the last one I talked about here in class is that Jackson does have the distinction of being the first president ever to experience an assassination attempt on him. And this occurred at the Capitol. You had a person who was pretty much unhinged, and he came up within point-blank range and pulled out a single-shot Derringer pistol and went to fire it at the president. It misfired. He quickly reached into his coat and grabbed another one. That one also misfired, and then Jackson basically was, upon him and just basically beat him until he got pulled off by his own kind of supporters there. I believe the man eventually would go to jail and things like that, so obviously he had some mental issues. But Jackson's the first president ever to actually suffer an attempt and then be successful in thwarting it. So there is where we end section 11.1, Jacksonian Democracy.